Okay, there, now we're recording. Thanks, Christian. So externalities are when basically the typical example is when there are hidden costs of production. And so it's important to realize that when economists construct this measure of social welfare, which, remember, we mean welfare in the sense of well-being, how well off is society as a result of the economic activity that's taking place. Normally, remember, we focus on total surplus, which we show is consumed of, are composed of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and then tax revenues, because tax revenues can be spent to benefit somebody. So all of that is economic surplus. But notice we've just focused on the two, what you would call primary parties in the transaction. There's the buyer, which is one party, and the seller, which is the other party, and sometimes there's a government, which is a third party. But we tend to focus on what are the impacts of the trade for the good in question, the good we're dealing with, for the buyers and the sellers. But sometimes buyers and sellers have a way of shifting costs onto other parties, third parties other than the government, right? Somebody else. And so pollution is a really good example of that. It's what we call an external cost. And it's external in the sense that, again, it's not internal to the decision makers that are making the decision to produce or purchase the good. It's being pushed off onto somebody else. So it's an external cost. And so, for example, if you talk about, an industry where there's lots and lots of pollution, and actually, I don't know. So who else besides Ezekiel has a mic? Let's see. Nicole, are you here? Hey,
Christian says he has a mic, I think.
Nicole?
Yeah.
Were you gonna? Okay, how's it going?
I
Eh?
have an exam to take right after this.
Oh, you have an exam to take right after this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll talk to someone else then. to give you a little bit of a break. Let's see. So does anybody else want to volunteer? I heard another voice for a minute. Okay. So what about Aldo? You here? What I really need is somebody with a high interest in politics and public policy. How about you, Yamil? Do you qualify? Are you here?
Hello.
Oh, okay. Who's talking? Is this?
No.
Wait, no. Wait, who just said?
You can go.
Okay, I need the two names. I'll talk to you both. I think I recognize one of them is Lawrence. Who's the other person?
Oh, I'm Yamil, but I don't think I'm qualified.
Okay, Yamil, that's fine. Was Lawrence the other voice?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay. Yamil, it's not really that high of a. So I'll talk to you first. I talk to Lawrence a lot, so I like to kind of mix it up a little bit. But Lawrence, you stay on if you have a comment. Did you guys, either of you, watch any of the presidential debates?
Yes, sir. I watched both of them.
You did? Okay. And what about you, Yamil?
Not really. Like, I watched a little bit of it.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you remember, but in the last debate, there was this one, and it's only one moment in the whole thing. So like, I'm not expecting that you seized on it, but they talked about people who lived along, and this was actually the President-elect Biden mentioned this, there are people that live along fence lines of plants that are oil refineries, and he talked about them being exposed to pollution. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I don't. I don't think I watched that one.
Yeah, but you remember it, Lawrence, right?
Yeah, I can't remember just a little bit of it because okay, so the first debates I watched like the whole thing, and this, the vice president debate I watched the whole thing, but the last debate I kind of just watched like kind of skim through it.
Okay. So yeah, so this is just one example where, and people talk about it down here. We have these oil refineries in San Pedro that people who live next to the oil refineries, occasionally the oil refineries um, emit toxic substances, usually accidentally. If something fails in their equipment and they have to release a bunch of gas. But people, and so they've actually installed these pieces of equipment that monitor the air quality along the fence line. But people have complained for a long time that living next to those oil refineries is dangerous to the health of the people in the community because they get exposed to these toxic substances, and so there's higher incidence of asthma and other things like that. So the point is that all those people that live in those communities that are affected by pollution, they bear a cost, right? If the producer doesn't do a really good job of making sure there's next to no pollution coming out of their factory, then they're exposing other people, and then those people actually have real world costs. And it's not just pain and suffering, but they might have to take medication and go visit the doctor. And that's also a cost that society bears as a result of the productive activity. So do you see what I mean, Yamil? That there could be other costs. It's not, they're just producing gas, they're buying oil, but they're also generating this other cost for society.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. So the point is that when we look at the market equilibrium just considers buyers and sellers, the seller's costs and the buyer's value. It doesn't consider the costs or the desires of the other people that are affected by the production. And so in that sense, it can be inefficient. The market equilibrium can, in the case of most goods that generate these external costs, the market participants, because they don't see the costs, they're shoving them off on somebody else, they'll engage in too much economic activity, they'll produce too much of the good, they'll consume too much of the good. And another good example, which maybe it's better to talk about vaping, but we used to talk about secondhand cigarette smoke. The sellers sell the tobacco, the buyers buy the cigarettes, but there are people that are exposed to secondhand cigarette smoke, and they have to bear the cost of that. Obviously there's been a lot of regulation, so that doesn't happen a lot anymore, but there are people that are exposed to vape stuff and things like that they don't want to, and they might have health consequences from that. So here's a quick rundown of the examples, but when we get down to the gist of it, we also want to point out that there can be, and these are harder to point out. It's easier to point out pollution and things that annoy people that are a byproduct. And that's, you can think of externalities or external costs as being a byproduct of some economic activity. But they're also not just negative or external costs, there are sometimes external benefits. And in that case, instead of the government wanting to go in and reduce the activity in that area, they actually want to promote it. And really, The headliner is the third bullet point, which is research into new technologies. So it turns out that when new technologies are developed, there are a lot of what you might call spin-off products. And as a result of that, the people that build off of those new discoveries create a lot of economic activity and a lot of benefits that aren't normally captured by the person that generates the discovery. And so the other one that we'd like to talk about, and it's pretty common, is immunizations. So if I get a coronavirus vaccine, right, and you don't, I'm still generating a benefit to you because it means you're less likely to be exposed, right? And so there are all of the, costs that you could bear from getting ill that are a smaller chance you're going to get ill because I got the vaccine. So there are these cases where people can engage in activity that they benefit third parties, unintended beneficiaries of the economic activity. And in that case, whether there's a positive externality or a negative externality, if you look at the market alone, the market only considers the cost of the private supplier and the private buyer, and it won't consider the costs or the benefits to third parties. And in that sense, it'll end up being inefficient. So this is a quick summary of it. Negative externalities lead markets to produce a larger quantity that is socially desirable, and positive externalities lead markets to produce, it should say, a smaller quantity. This is an error in the slide, a smaller quantity than is socially desirable. So how do we factor these costs into our analysis? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. And the analysis that you do, there are a couple different ways to do it, but I'll emphasize the way that makes the most sense and is most straightforward. And that is that in this case, we have an analysis of a negative externality. And you just simply say, okay, I know supply is the private cost, but we want to consider the total social cost of the activity. So you just add the cost of pollution to the private costs, and you end up getting this social cost, right? And where the social cost crosses the demand curve or the private value, that's what we would call socially optimal quantity of the good. Now, there's something that's important to note, right? Which makes most economic analysis of these pollution problems, or what you might call, more broadly, these external cost and benefit situations, different from the way that other disciplines analyze them. I mean, you might look at it like from a moral perspective and say, listen, it's just immoral for somebody to shove a cost onto another person. If I'm going to smoke cigarettes, it's just bad for me. It's impolite. I shouldn't, blow smoke in your face and make you suffer from it. But that's not the answer that economics comes up with. Economics, again, we try to stay away from these moral judgments. We're just trying to count up the costs and benefits associated with things. And in the realm of economics, there's no reason to absolutely come up with a law that, for example, forbids people from ever smoking in public. The idea is that if the person that's smoking benefits more than the total costs, including the private costs and the cost to third parties, then it's still economically beneficial to allow that person to smoke. So normally you end up with this situation where, as if you were looking at it from a moral perspective, you would say, oh, there is no quantity of the good that should be allowed. It should be at zero. Notice that the social optimum isn't at zero. Instead, when you look at the social optimum, you can see, oh, okay, at that point, the private value, the benefit to the person doing the activity, is covering both the social costs due to the external effect, the cost on the third party, and they're covering the costs of the supplier. The difference is at the equilibrium, right? At that quantity, they're only covering the costs of the supplier and they're not covering the costs of the third party. So it's an interesting analysis because you don't get the answer that you might think is, obvious, which is, well, if you're shoving some cost onto a third party, you just shouldn't do that. And there are some strategies for what we call internalizing externality, and that's part of what the government does. A lot of times the government will tax goods that generate external effects so that people participating in the transaction, the buyer and the seller, can see the tax and consider that when they can't see the cost on the third party directly. That's one way of correcting the externality problem. But at this point in time, you should just note that where the social cost, which includes the external cost, the cost of pollution, and all of the private costs of the supplier, where that crosses the demand curve is the socially optimal quantity of the good. And here, it's less than the market equilibrium quantity. So if we let the market do its own thing and be completely unregulated, then we'll get too much of this good being produced, and therefore too much pollution from a social perspective. It'll be inefficient. So let's see. Now we'll talk a little bit about internalizing externalities. And again, that's altering incentives so people take into account these external effects. And one way, and the way that we're going to talk about that's most common, and you guys might have noticed that this diagram looks an awful lot like a diagram in which there's a tax on the supplier. Remember, when there's a tax on the supplier, we shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. So what that's telling us is that we could correct this by putting a tax on the producer, and that's going to reduce the quantity of the good that's traded. So with positive externalities, it's different because there's a benefit to the bystander. And if there's a benefit, that means the social values actually exceeds the private value. So let's take a look at a positive externality case. So here, they're giving an example of education. And there are a lot of people that think that the government should subsidize education. As a student at a state university, that your education is being subsidized. And you might argue that, well, they should subsidize it because, education is intrinsically good. It's just better to have an educated population. But the economic argument is different. The idea is that there's some private value to education. That's what you would be willing to pay. But there are additional benefits that go to other people, not just you and maybe your future potential employer from the education that you receive, but to society more generally. And it's easiest to see those benefits when we're talking about primary education. So education that school children receive in their first 8 years of education. It's not common today in most developed modern economies, but a couple hundred years ago, illiteracy was the norm. And if you look at a lot of developing countries these days, you'll see that they have illiteracy rates on the order of 50 or 60% of their population. And so you might understand that it's good to have a literate population for lots of reasons. It just makes communication easier, right? When you can write something down or send somebody an email and they can read it. Whether it's communicating with a government official or it's communicating with, you know, your neighbor, and you can leave them a note. So there are benefits that we all receive from having a generally educated population, and you could kind of try to extend those benefits more broadly by talking about decisions that people make when they vote in a democracy, that a more well-informed citizenry is going to be making better decisions. But the main point is that the individual that gets the education themselves isn't the only person that benefits from their education. And so what we do is, with the positive externality, you'll notice we take the private value and then we add the external value, and we end up with this social value curve. And again, notice that the socially optimal level of education in this case is greater than what the private market level of education is. Okay, so let's see. Beverly, are you here this morning? No, Beverly.
Yeah, but it's a little noisy over here
Oh, for you or for me?
for me.
That's okay. I can deal with the noise. It's, you know what we would call that? We would call that a negative externality, like dogs barking in the background or something. Anyway, so Beverly, do you understand what I've said? Basically, it's this diagram that captures the positive externality, and notice how you end up with more of the good than what the market would produce. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's this diagram. If you're trying to figure out like what to do on Ignithium, it's this diagram for the negative externality and this one for the positive externality that will help you get a good start on most of the problems. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
No.
No. Okay. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, question?
Oh, Lawrence.
Yeah,
So,
Lawrence.
so negative externalities. So that would be like the earlier like factories, they
Yeah,
release, like air
pollution.
pollution and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So why is positive? What's
Well, like I said, with the example of education, is that when you're educated, Lawrence, you're not the only one that benefits from that. There are other benefits to
oh
other people in society. So like I benefit from you being educated because like I can talk to you on Zoom, right? You know how to use a computer.
also education? Oh, I get it now.
Yeah, education is one example. The other ones we gave were immunizations. You know, if you get, I mean, it's so funny because people, you know, immunization is so common in this country that people don't realize how awful the diseases are that a lot of us are immunized against. But you know, like measles, right? Um, uh, you know, those are pretty awful diseases, and you don't have to worry about getting them, Lawrence, because even if you didn't get the vaccine, most people you know are vaccinated against measles, so you'll never get it. Okay. Um, so anyway, um, we've talked about externalities, positive and negative. And remember, in the case of a negative externality, then the most common way to correct a negative externality is to use a tax. We call that a Pigovian tax. It's just named after an economist named Arthur Pigou. He first came up with the idea. But when it comes to internalizing positive externalities, a negative tax, remember, a tax is when the government takes money away from you. When the government gives you money for something, like gives you money to help support your education, it's called a subsidy. So that's the primary method for internalizing positive externalities. You give people subsidies for their education so they get more education. And when we're talking about research and invention, patent and copyright laws are also another way that the government is incentivizing innovation or research and development, right? So companies that oh, okay, yeah. So Nicole, yeah, you're right. And are you still there, Nicole? Can you chat for a minute? Oh, do you have a mic? It's easier to just talk with people.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. How are you doing this morning?
I'm okay.
Just okay, not better.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, it is. But you know what's the thing that most people don't think about is they think, oh, okay, well, if I get vaccinated or other people are vaccinated around me, they generate this positive externality, kind of, they call it like herd immunity. Like, I don't have to get vaccinated because I'm not going to get exposed to chicken pox or measles or something like that. But you know what's the real key group that benefits from it?
The immunocompromised.
Yeah, there are some people,
Because
normally it's people that are cancer patients. And when you're undergoing cancer treatment, for particular types of bone marrow cancer and things like that, the therapies that they use to try to heal you from the cancer make your immune system such that you can't get a vaccine, because a vaccine oftentimes involves a weakened form of the virus, and if you get exposed to it, it'll just kill you. So yeah, we all get vaccinated, but we generate this benefit for the people that you talked about, the immunocompromised, right?
Mhm.
So, but a lot of people don't go ahead.
What is the best reason you would consider vaccination a public good?
Well, I think the to consider it a public good, there has to be a positive externality, right? And if I was going to think about like all of the different ways in which you could end up getting a positive externality, the top of my list would probably be you know avoiding exposure for people who are immunocompromised. And there are a lot of people in that category when you consider elderly and ill people and cancer patients and things like that. So I think there are a lot of benefits there, right?
Mhm.
The way that economists normally calculate the value of those benefits is based on the statistical value of life. And there are lots of studies that are done by economists and used by the federal government when you're reducing the risk of death to a group of people. And basically it comes out, depending upon how you do this study, that the value of a life from a statistical perspective is between like $7 and $9 million. And then you multiply that by the number of people you think you're going to save, and that can be a pretty big number that you can quantify. But the other area that I think is, so the alternative is, people, you probably know that a lot of these diseases cause birth defects and other things like that. So by avoiding exposure, you're avoiding the costs to society of having to treat the people that are seriously impaired by their illness. And moreover, I think that to the extent that you would say that, we are connected to one another through the healthcare system, meaning that there's scarcity there. So if lots of sick people were going to the doctor for things, it might be more difficult for you to get treated. There could be an argument that there are some external benefits from reducing infections more generally to other people who might need to go to the doctor and might not be able to get all of the medical attention that they would be able to get if those people who were ill from viruses and things that you could immunize against were seeking medical treatment. But yeah, the top line, I think, is the immunocompromised. Can you think of another positive externality that I'm missing?
Not really.
No, I mean, yeah, and it's kind of hard because, right, it has to be, you get the vaccine, but it's a benefit to somebody else. And I think that the people in that category most clearly are the immunocompromised. So, okay. All right. So, and by the way, if you do put something in chat, if anybody does, you should also kind of like say or just like yell something out too, because I can't keep chat and everything else up at the same time, or I can't see my screen. So anyway, so we've talked about these government solutions, these taxes and subsidies that can internalize externalities, but there are cases in which there's very little government intervention required, and the key idea there is something called the Coase theorem. So the Coase theorem was first proposed by a person who won the Nobel Prize in economics, Ronald Coase, but he was actually a professor of law at University of Chicago, and he just made this observation that you really don't need the government to interfere necessarily in cases in which you have, let's say, for example, there's the pollution coming from the oil refinery. Well, how might that be solved without government intervention? Well, it could be the case that the people that live along the fence line and the people that run the oil refinery could just bargain amongst themselves and come up with some price where the people who are living along the fence line say something like, well, for the pain and suffering, we want so much money, and for this risk, we want so much money, and if we end up having any medical issues, we want you to pay for that. And if it turns out that it would be less expensive for the oil company to just like pay those private parties so that they didn't object to the infrequent exposure to these chemicals, then everybody's happy, and you don't have to have the government involved directly. But Coase also pointed out that even though you can have these private parties bargain without the government, there are a couple of issues that make that difficult in some cases. One of them is what we would call transactions costs. And transactions costs are the costs of actually doing the negotiation. So you can imagine like drawing up a contract and coming up with some sort of a settlement agreement and getting everybody to agree that it was okay for the oil refinery to operate in the way that it had been if they just guaranteed to pay these certain sums of money. And normally, as you can imagine, transactions costs are really high if there are a large number of people involved. So the example that I gave about the community living near the oil refinery, that probably is not a really good case for private party bargaining for lots of reasons. But one in particular is that I'm sure there are some people in the community that would object, right? That the price was too low, that they wanted even more money. Maybe there are people with particular health conditions or things like that, or people that are particularly concerned. And so negotiating separate agreements for all the people in the community would just be really time consuming and very costly. So they might not bargain. There's another reason why that private parties sometimes don't bargain, despite even if transactions costs being low. And it's another one that Coase pointed out, and that is that it's not always clear that the property rights at issue are well defined enough for the parties to be able to bargain. So what do we mean by that? Well, when you think about something like air quality, the issue is who owns the air, right? If there was no government involved or anything like that, you could imagine that the oil refinery would just say, well, the air is there, I can just pollute as much as I want, and like, too bad for you. But that's an assumption, right? If instead, we assumed that the people in the community had a right to have clean air, and it was a right that they could trade away. In order for it to be a property right, it has to be something that you can transfer. Then you could have some bargaining taking place. But the way things are right now under current law, it's not clear who really owns the right to control the quality of the air. So that's something that has to be settled upon first, because the oil refinery can't buy something that the people in the community don't have a right to sell to them through these negotiations. So in a lot of cases, government intervention is required because the property right at issue doesn't allow for negotiations to really take place because the property rights aren't well defined. So what normally happens is, when these situations arise, if you don't have a tax or a subsidy as a solution, then a lot of times governments will use what we call command and control policies, where the government just simply mandates that the oil refinery has to use a certain type of non-polluting equipment, or that they cannot exceed certain emission levels, that sort of thing. Those are what we call command and control policies. And then the other types of policies are what we call market-based policies. And market-based policies includes the taxes and subsidies that we've already mentioned. So again, for command and control policies, they normally forbid certain behaviors or require certain behaviors. So for example, requirements that all students be immunized, to go to school in a public school, and stipulations on pollution levels are examples of command and control policies. So and again, the government-based policies that are market oriented are these taxes and subsidy schemes. And specifically here you see the language of Pigovian taxes. Are those, I mean, it's the same taxes that we're talking about, but the Pigovian tax is attributing it to the person that first came up with the idea. So one other type of regulation that we want to talk about a little bit is, so there's the Pigovian tax, but there's also, in the case of air quality regulation, this has been used quite a lot, is for the government to set a pollution target and then calibrate the tax so that they achieve, the firms that are polluting achieve that particular target. But there's another way of doing it, which is to come up with the pollution allowance and then divide it up into units, and then write these little certificates that give a right to pollute. Like, let's say, and I don't know if anybody's ever seen this or not, but normally the way the government does it is they set their pollution allowance regulation in terms of tons of pollution. So if the government says you can have, it's safe to have 40,000 tons of a common pollutant that's an air pollutant that's associated with oil production is sulfur dioxide. So if the government says you can have 40,000 tons of sulfur dioxide emitted safely in a year, then they will come up with these, oftentimes these certificates that say this certificate is good for emitting 1 ton of sulfur dioxide. So you'd have 40,000 of these certificates, and they're called pollution permits. And then they distribute them to the oil refining plants. And then they also allow the oil refining plants to trade them. So they create this market for these emission permits. And the last part of this chapter is just showing that this is, the demand for pollution rights. And if you produce a tax of a certain level, then you can achieve a certain target of pollution. But you can also do that with these tradable permits by, again, getting this demand for pollution rights and setting this supply as the quantity of pollution rights. So these tradable emission permits are, I would say, within the last 20 years have become more common than pollution taxes. And they're used in particular in the state of California for the regulation of carbon dioxide emissions, which you probably know are a greenhouse gas pollutant that contributes to global warming. So the state of California has a carbon permit regulatory scheme, and it was one of the first in the country to do it. There are a couple of other tradable emission permit schemes, but the first one for carbon regulation in the United States was the California market, and it was passed into law in 2006. So that is it for this lecture.